The alarm did not sound like a warning. It sounded like the end of everything. I was standing in the communication tower of Ilvain Station when the walls shook for the third time that hour, and dust fell from the ceiling like gray snow. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the datapad twice before I finally held it steady enough to read the numbers on the screen. The numbers told me we had less than 2 days left. My name is Kale Doran, and I was a junior signal officer for the Veltari Assembly. 2 days ago, I had a quiet job. I checked frequencies. I logged incoming messages from trade ships. I ate my evening meal with my sister and complained about how slow the elevators were in our tower. Now I was standing in a room full of officers twice my age, all of them arguing about which cities to abandon first, because the Skarn Dominion fleet was 17 hours away from our capital, and we did not have enough ships left to stop them. The Skarn did not come to negotiate. They did not come to trade. They came to take, and when they were finished taking, there was usually nothing left standing. We had seen what happened to the colony at Ressa Prime. We had seen the recordings, the ones the Assembly tried to keep quiet, the ones that showed empty streets and silent buildings with no survivors left to explain what happened. Nobody wanted to end up like Ressa Prime, but nobody in the galaxy was willing to help us avoid it. I had sent 11 requests for aid that week. 11. To the Trellian Concord, who told me they were too far away. To the Orsa Combine, who told me their fleet was needed elsewhere. To the Half-Light Federation, who did not even bother to reply. Every single one of them had ships. Every single one of them had the power to help. And every single one of them decided that our small, peaceful world was not worth the risk. I remember standing at my station that night, staring at a star map with red markers spreading across it like a disease, and I remember feeling something inside me break. Not sadness, something sharper than sadness, something closer to anger. There was one frequency left that I had never used. It belonged to a species most of the galaxy avoided talking about, mostly out of fear, sometimes out of old prejudice, and sometimes because nobody had actually met them and simply repeated stories they had heard from someone else. Humans. Our own government had signed an old agreement, one many people called the Soul Accord, which discouraged any contact with human territory. The official reason was caution. The unofficial reason, whispered in hallways and never written down, was fear. I had heard stories about their wars, their strange loyalty to each other, the way they fought battles that made no sense by galactic standards, throwing themselves into fights other species would have already surrendered. Nobody knew if those stories were true. Nobody wanted to find out. I did not care anymore. 2 days, that was all my planet had left, and the strongest fleets in the galaxy had already turned their backs on us. I opened the old frequency. My supervisor, an older Veltari named Doran, tried to stop me. He grabbed my arm and told me I would be arrested for breaking the accord, that I would bring something onto our world that we could not control. I looked at him and asked a simple question. What did it matter if I broke a rule meant to protect us, if following that rule meant we would not survive long enough to be punished for breaking it? He let go of my arm. I recorded the message myself. I did not use official language. I did not follow any diplomatic script. I simply spoke, because I did not know if there would be time for anything more careful than the truth. I said that my planet was under attack. I said that our fleet was outnumbered and our defenses were failing. I gave our location, our system coordinates, and the estimated time before the enemy fleet arrived. I said that every other civilization we had asked for help had refused us. And then, because I did not know what else to say, I simply asked, "Please, if anyone receives this message, please help us." I sent it into the dark, toward a border none of our ships had ever crossed, aimed at a single relay buoy that our engineers believed could reach human space. I did not expect an answer. I told myself I did not expect an answer, because expecting one would have been foolish. The humans owed us nothing. We had never spoken to them before. We had, if anything, quietly avoided them for generations, the same way most of the galaxy did. I went back to my post and tried to focus on tracking enemy ship movements, because that was the only thing I could still control. Every few minutes, the room lights flickered from the strain on the power grid. Somewhere below us, engineers were rerouting energy from residential districts to keep our remaining defense platforms online. I could hear people crying in the corridor outside, quietly, the way people cry when they have already accepted something terrible is coming and are simply waiting for it to arrive. Then, 3 hours after I sent the message, my console made a sound I had never heard it make before. An incoming transmission, not from any Veltari frequency, not from any known ally. The signal was clean, sharp, and impossibly fast for something coming from such a distance. My hands hovered over the console. Doran was standing behind me now, and I felt him go very still. I opened the channel. There was no long introduction, no formal greeting, no diplomatic seal, no cautious testing of words the way every other species always did before speaking to someone new. Just a voice, calm, steady, a voice that did not sound afraid, even though the situation I had described should have made anyone afraid. The voice asked for our exact coordinates. It asked how many people were in the capital, how many were wounded already, and how much time we had left before the enemy fleet arrived. It did not ask why we had contacted them instead of our usual allies. It did not ask about the Soul Accord. It did not lecture me about the danger of breaking old agreements. It simply asked what we needed, as if that question were the only one that mattered. I gave the coordinates with a shaking voice. I gave the numbers, casualties so far, estimated time until the Skarn fleet reached orbit. Ship counts on both sides, though I was embarrassed to admit how small ours had become. There was a short pause after I finished speaking, just long enough for me to wonder if I had imagined the entire conversation. Then the voice said something I will never forget. It said, "Help is coming. Hold on." The channel closed. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the blank console, unsure if I should feel relieved or terrified. Doran asked me what they said. I told him. He did not look relieved either. He looked the way I imagine someone looks when they open a door, expecting an empty room, and instead find something looking back at them. Word spread through the tower within minutes. Some officers were angry that I had contacted humans without authorization. Others were desperate enough not to care. Our planetary council was called into emergency session, arguing over whether to trust a species almost nobody in our government had ever actually met. I did not attend that meeting. I stayed at my post, watching the tracking display, waiting to see if the promise I had received was real or simply words meant to comfort a frightened stranger. 6 hours passed. The Skarn fleet grew closer on our display, a cluster of red markers advancing steadily through the outer system, patient and unstoppable, the way predators move when they already believe the outcome is certain. Then, just past the edge of our sensor range, new markers appeared. They were small, far smaller than I expected. I remember feeling a flash of disappointment, almost betrayal, thinking that whoever had answered my call had sent only a handful of ships to face an entire invasion fleet. I remember thinking that we had gambled everything on a species we did not understand, and the gamble had failed before it even began. Doran leaned over my shoulder and asked how many ships. I told him, 7. 7 ships, against a Skarn fleet of over 40. I did not know, in that moment, standing in a shaking tower with dust still falling from the ceiling, that those 7 ships were about to change everything I believed about strength, about courage, and about what it truly meant to answer a call for help. I only knew that for the first time in 2 days, for reasons I could not explain, I felt something other than fear. I felt hope. And I had no idea yet how much that hope was about to be tested. 7 ships. That number repeated itself in my mind like a broken recording. 7 ships against a fleet that had already swallowed 3 worlds whole. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that more were coming behind them, hidden somewhere in the dark where our sensors could not reach. I kept watching the display, waiting for more markers to appear. None did. Doran ordered me to open a channel to the incoming ships immediately. My hands were still shaking, but I managed to establish contact within seconds. This time, the voice that answered was different from before. Younger, sharper, with an edge of energy in it that almost sounded like excitement, though I could not understand how anyone could feel excitement while flying toward a battle they were outnumbered in. The voice introduced himself as Daniel Hart, and said he was the commanding officer of the small fleet approaching our system. He asked for an updated status on our defenses, our remaining ships, and the exact formation of the Skarn fleet. I gave him everything I had. He listened without interrupting, occasionally repeating a number back to confirm he had heard it correctly, and when I finished, there was no hesitation in his voice at all. He said they would arrive in 4 hours. He asked us to hold our position and continue tracking enemy movements, and to keep our remaining defense platforms active for as long as possible. Then he said something that confused me at the time. He said not to send any more of our own ships forward until his fleet arrived, because he did not want us caught in the middle of what was about to happen. I remember asking him, almost without meaning to, if 7 ships would be enough. There was a short pause on the line. Then he said that numbers were not always the most important thing in a fight, and that his people had learned that lesson a long time ago, the hard way. I did not know what to make of that answer. Doran certainly did not trust it. He argued that we should prepare an evacuation plan for the capital regardless, in case the human fleet failed to make a difference. Our council agreed, and within the hour, transport ships were being loaded with civilians, families carrying only what they could hold in their arms, children too frightened to cry anymore, simply staring at the dark sky as if searching for an answer that had not yet come. I stayed at my post through all of it, watching the human fleet close the distance on our display. 4 hours felt endless. I kept thinking about Ressa Prime, about the recordings nobody wanted to admit they had watched more than once, about empty streets that used to be full of people. I did not want my own home to become another quiet warning shown to other worlds who refused to help the next time someone screamed for it. At the 2-hour mark, the Skarn fleet altered its formation. Their sensors must have detected the incoming human ships because their advance slowed, and their outer ships began spreading into a wider defensive pattern. For the first time since the invasion began, the enemy hesitated. It was a small thing, barely a change in their movement pattern, but I had been watching Skarn fleets for 2 days straight, and I had never seen them hesitate before. Doran noticed it too. He asked me what I thought it meant. I told him I did not know, but that if an enemy fleet capable of erasing entire colonies was pausing because of 7 approaching ships, then whatever was inside those ships was not something to underestimate. At the 1-hour mark, Daniel Hart opened the channel again. His voice was calmer now, almost gentle, and he asked how our people in the capital were holding up. I told him about the evacuation, about the fear spreading through the tower, about how many of us had not slept in 2 days. He was quiet for a moment before responding. He said he understood fear better than most people would guess, and that it was all right to be afraid, as long as we did not let it decide what we did next. I asked him why his people had come. Out of every civilization we had contacted, every ally with far greater resources than a handful of ships, his was the only one who answered. I asked if it was some kind of treaty obligation, or a strategic interest in our system, or anything that made logical sense to me. He laughed softly, which surprised me, given the situation. He said there was no treaty, there was no strategic interest. He said someone asked for help, and that was usually enough of a reason for his people. I did not understand that answer then. I would understand it much better by the end of that day. At exactly the 4-hour mark, the human fleet crossed into our system. I watched their ships appear on our display, small and strange compared to Skarn cruisers, moving in a formation that did not resemble any tactical pattern I had studied. They were not lining up defensively. They were spreading out, fast, aggressive, cutting directly toward the edge of the enemy fleet instead of forming a protective barrier around our capital, the way any cautious commander would have done. Doran said it looked like a mistake. I was not so sure. I had spent 2 days learning the rhythm of Skarn movement, the way they advanced patiently, confident in their numbers, expecting resistance to weaken and scatter the moment real pressure was applied. The human formation did not look like a mistake to me. It looked like they were trying to provoke a reaction, testing how the Skarn fleet would respond before committing to a full engagement. The Skarn responded exactly the way I expected. Their outer ships broke formation to intercept the human fleet, confident that 7 ships posed little threat to their numbers. It was, from a purely tactical standpoint, the correct decision. Overwhelming numbers should have ended the confrontation quickly. What happened instead changed everything I believed about how battles were supposed to unfold. The human ships did not meet the Skarn head-on. They scattered the moment contact was imminent, breaking into pairs and moving in patterns that seemed almost impossible to predict, using the confusion of their own formation change to slip past the Skarn's initial interception. 2 of their ships peeled away entirely, curving around the flank of the enemy fleet instead of engaging directly. I did not understand the purpose of that movement until several minutes later, when those 2 ships struck a cluster of Skarn support vessels from an angle the enemy had clearly not expected. Doran leaned closer to the display, his expression unreadable. I asked him what he thought was happening. He said, quietly, that he thought the humans were not fighting the way anyone fights a war they expect to survive through caution. He said they were fighting like people who had already decided the outcome did not matter as much as making the enemy pay a price for coming. I did not fully understand that observation at the time either. For the next hour, I watched something unfold that no report, no rumor, no old story about human wars had prepared me for. The Skarn fleet, an enemy that had swept through 3 worlds with barely any resistance, was being forced to slow down, to reposition, to react instead of advance. 7 ships were not defeating 40, not in any way that resembled a clean victory, but they were doing something almost as important. They were buying time. They were making the Skarn fleet fight for every meter of space instead of simply rolling forward unopposed. Daniel Hart's voice returned to our channel partway through the engagement, calm despite the chaos visible on our display. He asked for an updated position on our remaining defense platforms and requested that we redirect any functioning weapons toward the northern edge of the enemy formation, where his ships were pulling several Skarn vessels away from the main group. I relayed the request to our defense command immediately. For the first time since the invasion began, our remaining platforms had a clear, coordinated target instead of simply reacting to whatever came closest. It was strange, standing in that tower, giving coordinates to a species I had never met 2 days earlier, trusting a stranger's voice with decisions that could determine whether my planet survived the night. But I did trust him. Something in the way he spoke, calm even while flying directly into overwhelming odds, made it impossible not to. By the time the first hour of the engagement ended, the Skarn fleet had lost several ships. Not a decisive number, not enough to end the invasion outright, but enough to prove that the confidence they had carried into our system was no longer guaranteed. Their formation, once tight and controlled, had become ragged, spread thin, trying to respond to threats appearing from multiple directions at once. Doran turned to me and said something I will remember for the rest of my life. He said that in all his years of service, watching Allied fleets retreat from far weaker threats than the Skarn, he had never once seen anyone fight the way these 7 ships were fighting. Not recklessly, not without skill, but with a complete absence of the fear that governed every other species' decisions in the face of impossible odds. I asked him if he thought we would survive the night. He looked back at the display, at 7 small ships still weaving through a fleet, many times their size, refusing to break, refusing to retreat, and he said he was beginning to believe we might. I did not know yet that the hardest part of the battle was still ahead of us, or that within hours I would be standing face to face with the people flying those ships, learning firsthand that everything the galaxy whispered about humanity, both the fear and the fascination, barely scratched the surface of what they truly were. The order came just before dawn. One of the human ships had taken damage severe enough that it could no longer continue fighting, and Daniel Hart requested permission to land at our capital's medical bay so his injured crew member could receive treatment alongside our own wounded. Doran granted the request immediately, and within 20 minutes, I found myself standing on the landing platform of Ilvain Station, waiting to meet, for the first time in person, the species that had crossed an unfamiliar border to answer a stranger's call. The ship that landed was smaller than I expected, its hull scorched along one side, small scars marking places where enemy fire had come close enough to matter. Steam rose from a damaged section near the rear as the boarding ramp lowered. I stood there with two of our medical officers, unsure exactly what I expected to walk down that ramp. Something intimidating, perhaps, something that matched the fear the rest of the galaxy carried when they spoke about humanity. What walked down that ramp instead was a young woman, no older than I was, wearing a uniform stained with something dark along one sleeve, moving quickly, but without panic, carrying a crate of medical supplies under one arm as if it weighed nothing at all. She introduced herself as Grace Bennett, and before I could even finish my own introduction, she was already asking our medical officers where the injured needed to be taken, speaking with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing many times before. Behind her came two more crew members, carrying a third between them, a young man with a burn along his shoulder, who was, to my complete surprise, laughing quietly at something one of them had said, despite clearly being in pain. I did not understand how someone could laugh in that condition. I would learn, over the following hours, that this was simply how humans handled fear, not by pretending it did not exist, but by refusing to let it take control of the moment. Grace worked alongside our medical staff without hesitation, treating both human and Veltari patients with the same focus, the same steady hands, switching between medical terms I recognized and ones I had never heard before. At one point, she looked up from bandaging a young Veltari soldier's arm and asked me, without any trace of unkindness, why our medical bay had no proper triage system for handling multiple casualties at once. I admitted, embarrassed, that we had never needed one before. Our world had not faced a real war in generations. She nodded, not unkindly, and simply began organizing one herself, directing our staff with quiet authority that nobody questioned, not even our senior medical officer, who outranked her by every measure except experience in exactly this kind of crisis. It was strange, watching a stranger from another part of the galaxy take charge of our medical bay within minutes of arriving, and stranger still that everyone, myself included, trusted her instinctively. There was something in the way she moved, focused entirely on the person in front of her, that made it impossible to doubt her intentions. I asked her, during a brief pause between patients, how she managed to stay so calm. She looked at me for a moment, wiping her hands on a cloth, and said that panic never saved anyone, and that the moment you let fear take control of your hands, you stopped being useful to the people who needed you. She said it simply, like it was an obvious truth rather than something remarkable, and I remember thinking that if this was how ordinary human soldiers thought, I could not imagine what their leaders were like. Daniel Hart arrived at the station roughly an hour later, once the immediate crisis in orbit had stabilized enough for him to leave his ship under the command of another officer. He looked younger in person than his voice had suggested, though there was something in his eyes that made him seem far older than his face. He greeted me with a firm handshake, an unfamiliar gesture that I later learned was common among his people, and thanked me, of all things, for reaching out when we did. I told him I should be the one thanking him. He shook his head and said that waiting until the last possible moment to ask for help was something a lot of people did, out of pride or fear of rejection, and that reaching out, even when it felt hopeless, took more courage than most people gave it credit for. We walked together through the station corridors toward the command center, and along the way, I asked him questions I had been holding on to since our first transmission. I asked why his people had answered when nobody else would. I asked if there was some hidden purpose behind their assistance, some advantage they hoped to gain from helping a world they had never had contact with before. He was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously rather than brushing it aside. Then he said that his people had a long history of being the ones nobody wanted to have around, feared for reasons that were not always fair, misunderstood by civilizations who judged them from a distance rather than getting to know them directly. He said that when you spend generations being on the outside of things, you tend to remember what it feels like when someone finally treats you like you matter. He said that was not something they wanted anyone else to have to feel alone in, if they could help it. I did not know how to respond to that. It was a simple answer, but it carried a weight I had not expected. As we walked, I noticed small details about him that did not match the terrifying stories the rest of the galaxy told about his species. He greeted our station staff by name once he learned them, remembering details about their roles without needing to be reminded twice. He noticed a young Veltari technician struggling to carry a heavy equipment case and stopped immediately to help, despite being in the middle of a serious conversation with senior Veltari officers. He complimented our architecture, genuinely curious about how our buildings were constructed to withstand atmospheric pressure changes, asking questions with real interest rather than polite disinterest. But there were other moments too, quieter ones, that unsettled me in ways I could not fully explain. During a briefing in our command center, when one of our officers described the devastation at Ressa Prime in careful, clinical detail, expecting the human officers present to react with shock, Daniel and his crew simply listened, expressions calm, occasionally asking practical questions about troop movement and weapon signatures rather than reacting emotionally to the horror of what had happened. It was not that they did not care. I could see that they cared deeply, but there was a controlled steadiness in how they processed violence and loss that felt different from anything I had encountered before, as if they had learned, through hard experience, exactly how to keep functioning, even while feeling the full weight of tragedy. I asked Grace about this later, during a rare quiet moment while she cleaned equipment in the medical bay. I asked if human soldiers simply did not feel fear or grief the way we did. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice was quieter than before. She said they felt everything. Every loss, every risk, every fear before a battle. She said the difference was that her people had learned, through a long and difficult history, how to keep moving forward, even while carrying all of that weight, because stopping to fall apart in the middle of a crisis meant more people would not survive it. She said the calm I was seeing was not the absence of fear. It was fear, carefully controlled, redirected into action instead of paralysis. I asked her if that was difficult. She smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes, and said that it was, more often than people realized, but that it got easier with practice, in a way that was not entirely comforting to think about. Later that evening, I sat with a group of the human crew in the station's dining hall, sharing a meal that our kitchens had hurriedly adjusted to accommodate ingredients closer to what humans could safely eat. It was there that I met Ethan Cole, one of the pilots who had flown in the earlier engagement, a young man with an easy laugh and an endless supply of stories, most of which our translator struggled to properly convey the humor of. He told me about growing up on a world called Earth, about oceans that covered most of the planet's surface, about cities so densely packed with people that our entire capital could fit inside a single district of one of their largest metropolitan areas. He asked me questions about the Veltari in return, genuinely curious about our history, our culture, the small details of daily life that most visitors from other civilizations never bothered asking about. At one point, he asked what my sister was like, since I had mentioned her earlier without thinking, and he listened with real attention as I described her stubborn sense of humor and her habit of rearranging our apartment furniture every few months for no reason anyone could understand. It struck me, sitting there, that these were not distant warriors sent to fulfill some grand strategic purpose. They were people, ordinary, individual people who happened to belong to a species capable of extraordinary things when the situation demanded it, but who still laughed at bad jokes, still asked about each other's families, still felt tired and hungry and homesick the same way any of us did. And yet, beneath that warmth, there remained something unmistakably different about them. Later that night, walking past a small gathering of off-duty crew members near the station's observation deck, I overheard a quiet conversation between two of the human soldiers, their voices low, discussing something about a previous engagement in a tone that carried none of the discomfort I would have expected from people speaking about violence. It was not that they enjoyed it. It was the way they spoke about it plainly, without flinching, the same way someone might discuss a difficult but necessary task at work. It reminded me of something Grace had said earlier, about fear controlled rather than absent, and I found myself wondering exactly what kind of history had shaped a species capable of both such open kindness and such steady, unshaken resolve in the face of danger. Before I returned to my quarters that night, Daniel found me near the corridor leading to the communication tower. He told me the enemy fleet had regrouped several hours out from our system, likely preparing for a larger, more coordinated assault once they recovered from the losses they had already taken. He said his fleet would need reinforcement if we hoped to survive what was coming next, and that he had already sent a request back toward human territory, though he could not promise how quickly, or how many, additional ships might arrive in time. I asked him honestly whether he believed we would survive the coming battle. He looked toward the window, toward the dark sky, where somewhere beyond our sight an enemy fleet was regrouping to try again, and he said that survival was never guaranteed in any fight worth having, but that giving up before the fight even started was the only outcome that was truly certain to fail. I did not sleep much that night. I kept thinking about everything I had witnessed that day, about Grace's calm hands treating strangers as if they were her own people, about Ethan's easy laughter carrying real warmth despite everything he had already faced in orbit, about Daniel's quiet honesty when I asked him difficult questions he could have easily avoided. I thought about the stories the rest of the galaxy told about humanity, stories built on fear and distance rather than understanding, and I realized how completely wrong those stories were, or perhaps how incomplete they had always been. Humans were not simply dangerous. They were dangerous because they refused to give up, because they cared enough about people they had never met to risk everything for them, and because somewhere in their long, difficult history they had learned how to turn both compassion and courage into something the rest of the galaxy had never quite learned to understand. I did not know, lying awake in the dark, listening to the distant hum of the station's damaged systems being repaired around me, that the following day would bring the largest battle our world had ever faced, and that everything I thought I understood about strength and sacrifice was about to be tested in ways I could never have prepared for. The morning came with a warning instead of sunlight. Our sensors detected the Skarn fleet moving again, faster this time, no longer cautious after their earlier losses. Doran woke me before dawn with a message that made my stomach tighten immediately. The enemy fleet had grown. Reinforcements had arrived from somewhere beyond our sensor range during the night, bringing their total number to nearly 60 ships. Against them, we had our own remaining defenses, badly weakened from 2 days of siege, and 11 human ships, 4 having arrived overnight to join Daniel Hart's original 7. 11 ships against 60. I did not need to be a strategist to understand how impossible those numbers sounded. I found Daniel in the command center already, studying a tactical display with 2 of his officers, his expression focused but not panicked. When he noticed me, he explained the situation plainly, without softening the numbers to make me feel better. The Skarn fleet would reach our system within 3 hours. Their reinforcements included several heavier cruisers, ships capable of far greater damage than anything we had faced in the earlier engagement. He said this battle would be different from the last one, and that his people would need our full cooperation to have any real chance of success. I asked what we could do. Our own fleet was small, our weapons outdated compared to Skarn technology, and our defense platforms had already sustained damage from the previous assault. He said that was exactly why we mattered. He explained that his plan did not rely on matching the Skarn ship for ship, or weapon for weapon. It relied on using every advantage available, including the layout of our system itself, the placement of our defense platforms, and the detailed knowledge our people had of local space that no invading fleet could match. He asked for maps of every asteroid field, every debris cluster, every gravitational anomaly within 3 light hours of our capital. He said the Skarn had numbers, but we had knowledge of home ground they did not, and if used correctly, that knowledge could become a weapon of its own. For the next 2 hours, our command center became a strange blend of Veltari caution and human urgency, officers from both species working side by side, translating maps and terminology, building a plan that neither of our peoples could have created alone. Daniel listened carefully to our engineer's explanations of the debris field near our outer moon, then adjusted his formation strategy on the spot, incorporating details I would never have thought to consider important. Grace Bennett organized our medical bay for mass casualties, working alongside our own medical staff to prepare for the worst, while hoping it would not be necessary. Ethan Cole ran through flight simulations with our remaining pilots, teaching them evasive patterns his people had developed through generations of difficult conflicts, patterns that felt aggressive and unfamiliar compared to our traditionally cautious approach to combat. I did not fight in that battle myself. My place remained at the communication station, relaying information between our defense platforms and the combined fleet as the engagement unfolded. But I watched every moment of it on our tactical display, and what I witnessed that day changed everything I understood about what a small, determined force could accomplish against overwhelming odds. The Skarn fleet entered our system exactly on schedule, their formation tight and confident, clearly expecting a quick and decisive victory after their earlier setback. What they found instead was a trap built from every disadvantage they assumed did not matter. Daniel's ships did not meet the Skarn head-on this time. Instead, they drew the enemy fleet directly toward the debris field near our outer moon, using the confusion of scattered rock and metal fragments to break apart the Skarn's tight formation. Ships, built for coordinated, overwhelming assault, suddenly found themselves separated, forced into smaller groups, navigating dangerous terrain their sensors struggled to fully map. It was a risk for our own ships as well, but human pilots, trained for exactly this kind of chaotic, close-quarters engagement, moved through the debris field with a precision that our own pilots could only follow at a careful distance. I watched Ethan Cole's ship, identifiable by the marking our sensors had learned to track, weave between 2 massive fragments of rock with barely any margin for error, drawing a Skarn cruiser directly into a narrow channel where 2 of our defense platforms had a clear, unobstructed firing line. The cruiser, unable to maneuver quickly enough within the tight space, took heavy damage before it could retreat. And for the first time since the invasion began, I watched a Skarn capital ship break away from the fight entirely, its systems failing as it drifted out of formation. Doran, standing beside me, let out a breath I had not realized he was holding. He said quietly that he had never seen a plan like this before, one that turned every disadvantage our system possessed into a weapon against an enemy that outnumbered us so heavily. The battle stretched on for nearly 4 hours. There were moments of terrible fear, when a human ship took damage severe enough that it seemed certain to be lost, only for its pilot to somehow guide it through a narrow gap in the debris field and limp back toward the safety of our defense line. There was a moment when one of our own defense platforms was struck directly, and I watched the display go dark for several agonizing seconds before backup power restored its systems, the crew inside shaken but alive. There was a moment, near the middle of the engagement, when the Skarn fleet adapted to our tactics faster than expected, pushing a concentrated assault directly toward our capital's outer defenses, forcing Daniel to make a decision that I could hear the weight of even through the static of the comm channel. He ordered 3 of his own ships to intercept the assault directly, placing themselves between the Skarn attack and our capital's remaining civilians, despite knowing it meant facing concentrated enemy fire without the protection of the debris field's cover. I remember gripping the edge of my console as I watched those 3 ships hold their position, absorbing damage that should have destroyed them within minutes, buying enough time for our defense platforms to redirect and finally break the assault before it reached the city. When I spoke to Daniel afterward, once the immediate crisis had passed, I asked him how he made that decision so quickly, sending ships directly into what seemed like an impossible defense. He said there was no real decision to make. He said protecting the people who asked for help was the entire reason his fleet had come in the first place, and that letting the capital fall while his ships maneuvered somewhere safer would have made the entire mission meaningless. By the 4th hour, the Skarn fleet's formation had completely broken apart. Ships that had entered our system with overwhelming confidence were now scattered, damaged, and disorganized, unable to coordinate the kind of unified assault that had allowed them to conquer 3 worlds before ours. Their commanders, whoever or whatever directed the Dominion's forces, made the decision every predator eventually makes when the cost of continuing outweighs the reward of victory. They retreated, what remained of their fleet withdrawing from our system, leaving behind wreckage scattered across the debris field like the remains of a storm finally passing. The command center erupted into something I had never experienced before in my life. Officers who had spent 2 days preparing for our world's destruction found themselves instead watching the enemy retreat, and the sound that filled the room was not quite cheering, not quite crying, but something that carried both at once, the sound of people who had genuinely believed they would not survive, suddenly realizing they had. I found Daniel afterward, standing near the observation window, watching the last remnants of the Skarn fleet disappear from our sensor range. He looked exhausted, in a way that went beyond simple tiredness, the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent hours holding responsibility for lives that were not his own. I asked him if he had ever doubted, even for a moment, that the plan would work. He was quiet for a long time before answering. He said doubt was always present in a fight like that one, and that anyone who claimed otherwise was either lying or had not fully understood the stakes involved. He said the difference was not the absence of doubt, but the decision to act anyway, because the people counting on you deserved everything you had to give, regardless of how uncertain the outcome might be. I thought about that answer for a long time afterward, standing beside him in the quiet aftermath of a battle that should have ended in our destruction. I thought about 11 ships facing 60, about 3 vessels holding position against overwhelming fire to protect a city full of strangers, about a species that the rest of the galaxy feared and avoided, who had crossed an unfamiliar border for no reason beyond a single desperate message sent into the dark. I did not yet understand the full weight of what had happened that day, or how the events of the following weeks would begin to change the way the entire galaxy viewed humanity. I only knew, standing there watching the sun rise over a capital that was still standing, still full of people who would see another day, that the debt my world now carried could never truly be repaid, only honored, in whatever way we managed to find. The weeks that followed the battle passed differently than I expected. I imagined, once the immediate danger had faded, that life would simply return to what it had been before the Skarn arrived, that the human fleet would leave once their work was finished, and that the memory of those strange, extraordinary days would slowly settle into the kind of story people tell without fully believing anymore. That is not what happened. Daniel's fleet remained in our system for another month, helping our engineers repair the damage our defense platforms had sustained, sharing technical knowledge that our own scientists studied with the kind of fascination usually reserved for ancient discoveries. Grace spent much of that time working alongside our medical staff, training them in techniques for handling mass casualties that our world, thankfully, had never needed to develop before. Ethan became something of a local celebrity among our younger pilots, several of whom began requesting transfers specifically to learn under his guidance, eager to understand the flying patterns that had turned impossible odds into a victory nobody had expected. I spent much of that month as an unofficial liaison between our government and the human crew, translating not just words, but ideas, trying to help both sides understand each other beyond the surface details that had defined our first uncertain days of contact. It was during this time that I finally found the courage to ask Daniel the question that had been sitting in my mind since the very beginning, the question I had asked once before during the battle, but never received a truly complete answer to. We were sitting together on the observation deck of Ilvan Station, watching repair crews work on the outer hull of his ship, when I asked him directly, "Why did you come, when every other civilization we contacted refused? Your people had no treaty with us, no history with us, no reason to risk so much for a world you had never even heard of before that message reached you." He was quiet for a while, watching the stars rather than looking at me, and when he finally answered, his voice was simple, almost embarrassingly so, carrying none of the grand explanation I had expected after everything I had witnessed. He said, "You asked." I told him that could not be the entire reason. Surely there was something more, some deeper strategic purpose, some benefit his people hoped to gain from an alliance with a world as small and undeveloped as ours, compared to the greater powers of the galaxy. He shook his head and said that was exactly the kind of thinking his people had spent generations trying to move beyond. He explained that for a long time in their own history, humanity had been divided, fighting among themselves over exactly the kind of calculated self-interest I was describing, waiting to see what advantage helping someone else might bring before deciding whether they deserved assistance at all. He said it took his people a very long, very difficult road to understand that waiting for a reason before helping someone in danger was not caution. It was simply a more comfortable kind of cruelty, one that let people feel justified in looking away. He said that somewhere along that difficult road, enough of his people decided that a call for help should be answered because it was a call for help, and nothing more needed to be true beyond that. I did not know how to respond to something so simple and yet so completely different from everything I had been raised to believe about how civilizations were supposed to interact with each other. Every alliance our world had ever formed, every trade agreement, every diplomatic relationship had been built on careful calculation of mutual benefit. The idea that an entire fleet had crossed unfamiliar space simply because someone asked, without demanding anything in return, was almost impossible for me to fully accept, even after living through the proof of it myself. News of what happened at Ilvan Station spread through the wider galaxy faster than I expected. Other civilizations, the same ones who had refused our requests for aid, began sending careful, cautious inquiries to our government, asking questions about the humans, about the battle, about what exactly had allowed 11 ships to defeat a Skarn fleet nearly 6 times their size. I suspect many of them were less interested in celebrating our survival and more concerned about what this meant for the old assumptions they had built their caution around. The Sol Accord, the agreement that had once discouraged contact with human territory, began quietly unraveling within weeks. Representatives from the Trellian Concord, the same civilization that told me they were too far away to help us, requested a formal meeting with human diplomats, their tone noticeably different from the dismissive replies I had received during our darkest hours. The Orsa Combine followed shortly after, offering trade proposals that would have seemed unthinkable only a month earlier. It was strange, watching civilizations who had abandoned us in our moment of greatest need, suddenly eager to establish relationships with the species that had answered when they refused to. I asked Daniel once, during one of our final conversations before his fleet departed, whether it bothered him, watching the same governments who had ignored our pleas for help, now rushing to build alliances with his people once the danger had passed and the outcome had proven favorable. He gave me a tired smile and said that it did bother him, more than he usually let on, but that he had learned a long time ago that you could not force other people to care before they were ready to, and that all his people could really do was keep answering the calls that reached them, and let the rest of the galaxy decide for itself what kind of civilization it wanted to be. I thought that was one of the wisest things I had ever heard, though I did not tell him so at the time. On the day his fleet finally departed, I stood on the same landing platform where Grace had first walked down that scorched boarding ramp, carrying wounded from a battle none of us had expected to survive. The station around us looked different now, repaired, strengthened, marked in places with small memorials for those who had not made it through the siege, alongside quiet tributes to the human crew members who had given everything to make sure more of us did. Daniel shook my hand one final time, the same firm, unfamiliar gesture from our first meeting, and told me that if my world ever needed anything again, all we had to do was ask. He said it plainly, without ceremony, the same way he had answered every difficult question I asked him throughout that extraordinary month. I told him I hoped we would never need to ask again, though I knew, somewhere in the back of my mind, that the galaxy was rarely that kind. I watched his ship lift off the platform, followed by the rest of his fleet, small and unremarkable against the vastness of open space. Nothing about their appearance suggesting the impossible things they had done to protect a world that had nothing to offer them in return. I stood there long after they had disappeared from sight, thinking about everything that had changed in the span of a single month. I thought about the old fear that had shaped so much of the galaxy's understanding of humanity, a fear built on distance and assumption rather than actual experience. I thought about how completely that fear had been proven wrong, not because humans were not capable of great and terrible power, but because that power had been placed entirely in service of protecting people who had nothing to offer in exchange except gratitude. I became, over the following years, the official liaison between our world and human territory, a position that did not exist before the day I broke protocol and sent a message into the dark, expecting nothing in return. I have met many humans since that first battle, soldiers and scientists, diplomats and ordinary travelers, and while each of them carried their own individual personality, their own unique way of moving through the world, I have never once met one who did not carry, somewhere beneath the surface, the same simple belief that shaped Daniel's answer on that quiet observation deck so long ago. A call for help deserves an answer, simply because it is a call for help. I think often about that final conversation, about how strange it felt to hear something so simple carry so much weight. The galaxy is old, filled with civilizations who have learned, through long and often painful experience, to calculate the cost of kindness before offering it, to measure every act of assistance against the potential benefit it might bring in return. It is not an unreasonable way to think. Caution has kept many worlds alive throughout history, but I have come to believe that there is something the galaxy lost along the way, buried beneath generations of careful calculation, something that a small, desperate message sent from a dying tower managed to remind an entire civilization it had never even met before. Sometimes the only reason anyone needs to help someone in danger is that they asked. I do not know what the future holds for the relationship between my world and humanity, or for the wider changes still unfolding across the galaxy as more civilizations begin reconsidering the old assumptions that once kept humanity isolated on the edges of known space. I only know that when the next call for help reaches human territory, from whatever corner of the galaxy it comes, I believe, without doubt, that someone will answer. Because that is simply who they are. And because once, when my own world had nothing left to offer except a desperate plea into the dark, they proved it.